Good evening. Welcome to our Middle-earth sleep story series, Elven Sanctuaries. Let's begin. The forest stretched endlessly before them, a cathedral of towering trees whose canopies wove together in an intricate tapestry of light and shadow. Each step on the moss-carpeted path released the faint scent of earth and pine, while the distant murmur of a hidden stream harmonized with the occasional trill of unseen birds. Orlen tightened his cloak against the cool, mist-laden air, his gaze darting to the shifting patches of sunlight filtering through the leaves. Beside him, Cyrana moved with purpose, her blade resting lightly at her side, though her keen eyes never ceased their watchful sweep of the surroundings. Adric followed closely, his staff faintly aglow as it tapped rhythmically against the path, the gentle sound grounding their otherwise silent march. Calen, bringing up the rear, walked with a hesitance that betrayed his unease, his expression shadowed with the weight of recent events. "It's beautiful," Orlen murmured, breaking the silence, his voice reverent as he took in the ancient splendor of the woods. Cyrana nodded, though her tone remained pragmatic. "The beauty hides its secrets," she replied. "The elves have shaped this land for centuries, bending it to their will. It is both a sanctuary and a test." The path wound deeper into the heart of the forest, the trees growing denser and the air cooler with each passing moment. The world beyond seemed to fall away, replaced by an enveloping stillness that carried a subtle hum, as though the land itself whispered secrets too old for mortal ears. The glow of Adric's staff dimmed in the natural light, but its pulse seemed to sync with the rhythm of the forest, a connection he noted with quiet curiosity. "The elves' influence is strong here," Adric remarked, his voice low. "The magic in these woods feels alive." Cyrana paused briefly, her hand brushing against the rough bark of a nearby tree, its surface etched with faint, flowing patterns that seemed too deliberate to be natural. "This is their work," she said, her voice softer now. "They call these the singing trees. Each one holds the memory of the songs sung to it by generations of elves, a living history of their craft." Orlen ran his fingers over the patterns, his touch reverent, and was startled by the faint hum that vibrated beneath his fingertips. "It feels warm," he said, glancing at Cyrana. She gave a faint smile, though her eyes remained focused on the path ahead. "The forest accepts us for now," she said, "but that can change quickly if we overstep." As they pressed on, the path began to widen, the underbrush thinning as the trees gave way to an open glade bathed in soft, golden light. In the center stood an elegant structure that seemed to grow organically from the earth itself, a hall of pale stone and living wood, its walls entwined with vines heavy with blossoms. The air here was thick with the heady scent of flowers and the faint melodic strains of distant elven song. "This is it," Cyrana said, her tone carrying a mixture of relief and caution. "The first of the sanctuaries." Orlen's breath caught as he took in the sight. The hall's beauty unlike anything he had ever imagined. Its arches seemed to stretch effortlessly into the sky, their curves blending seamlessly with the surrounding trees, while faint runes glowed softly along the edges of its walls. As the group approached, the melodic song grew louder, resolving into a chorus of voices that seemed to flow from the very walls of the sanctuary. A pair of elven figures stepped from the shadows beneath the arches, their movements graceful and deliberate. They were clad in robes of shimmering green and silver, their features ageless and serene, though their eyes held an intensity that spoke of millennia of wisdom. "Travelers," one of the elves said, their voice melodic yet commanding. "You enter the sanctuary of Eryndor, a place of peace and reflection. Speak your purpose, for no step here is taken lightly." Cyrana inclined her head in a gesture of respect, her tone measured as she replied. "We come seeking knowledge," she said. "The relics we carry have brought us here, and the path we walk has grown dark. We seek guidance from those who hold the wisdom of the past." The elves exchanged a glance, their expressions unreadable, before the speaker stepped forward. "Knowledge is freely shared with those who honor it," they said. "But the burden of relics such as yours is not one to be borne lightly. The forest has already whispered of your coming, and the shadows that pursue you are known to us." Adric stepped forward, his staff still faintly glowing. "Then you know what we face," he said, his voice calm but firm. "The Keeper's legacy is tied to these relics, and the shadows will not stop until they've unraveled it. If there is wisdom here that can aid us, we humbly ask for it." The second elf, silent until now, stepped closer, their gaze sharp as they studied each member of the group. "The relics have bound themselves to you," they said, their voice softer but no less commanding. "Their secrets will reveal themselves in time, but only if you prove your Sims worthy of their trust. The sanctuary offers peace, but peace must be earned." The group was led inside, the air within the hall cool and filled with the scent of fresh herbs and blooming flowers. The walls glowed faintly, their surface etched with intricate patterns that seemed to shift subtly as they passed. Orlen felt a strange calm settle over him, as though the very atmosphere of the sanctuary eased the weight of his fears. They were guided to a central chamber where a pool of water shimmered with an unnatural light, its surface rippling gently despite the absence of any breeze. "This is the pool of clarity," the first elf explained. "It is a mirror of thought and intent. Those who seek its wisdom must face themselves within it." Orlen's chest tightened at the words, the memory of the mirror of memory fresh in his mind, but as he glanced at his companions, he saw the same mixture of awe and determination in their faces. Cyrana stepped forward first, her blade sheathed as she knelt before the pool. "We are ready," she said, her voice steady. The elves exchanged a glance, and the second elf gave a faint nod. "Then let the pool reveal what you carry," they said, "and may its clarity guide you forward." As Cyrana touched the water's surface, the room filled with a soft, resonant hum, and the light of the pool began to shift, casting intricate patterns onto the walls. Orlen took a deep breath, his hand brushing the ring in his pocket, and prepared to follow. The water of the pool of clarity shimmered like liquid starlight, its surface rippling softly as Cyrana's fingertips grazed it. The light reflected in her sharp eyes, casting faint patterns on her face, as if the pool itself recognized her presence. The room seemed to hold its breath, the faint hum of the Elven Sanctuary deepening into a resonant vibration that echoed through the hall's living walls. Orlen stood back, watching intently, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and awe. The air around the pool grew warmer, and the light shifted, its silvery glow giving way to a golden hue that poured upward like the first rays of dawn breaking over the horizon. Cyrana's body remained still, her expression calm but intent, though Orlen could see the faint tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers trembled slightly as the pool's light enveloped her. The elves who had led them here stood like statues at the edge of the chamber, their ageless faces unreadable, though there was an intensity in their gazes that suggested they understood far more than they revealed. The light of the pool began to coalesce, gathering into a swirling vortex that reflected the runes etched on the walls. Slowly, a scene began to form within the golden glow, an image that hovered between reality and dream. Cyrana's lips parted slightly as the vision unfolded, revealing an immense battlefield stretching beneath a sky of ashen grey. On the horizon, towering spires of jagged black stone pierced the clouds, their surfaces shimmering faintly with an unnatural light. Armies clashed below, their figures shrouded in shadow, though their movements spoke of desperation and fury. At the center of the battlefield stood a figure clad in silver and green, their presence commanding and their weapon glowing with the same golden light that now surrounded Cyrana. The figure raised their blade, and the battlefield froze, the shadows recoiling as though held at bay by an unseen force. The scene dissolved suddenly, and Cyrana gasped, her eyes snapping open as she pulled her hand back from the water. The pool stilled immediately, its light fading to its original silvery hue, though the tension in the room lingered. "What did you see?" Adric asked, his voice soft but insistent. Cyrana closed her eyes for a moment, her brow furrowed. "A war," she said, her voice distant. "A battle long past. Or perhaps yet to come." The Keeper's power was there, but it was fractured, scattered across the field, and in the distance, something loomed. Something vast and unrelenting. Her gaze shifted to the elves, her expression questioning. "What does it mean?" The elder elf stepped forward, their voice calm but edged with gravity. "The pool reveals only fragments," they said. "Reflections of what was, what is, and what might yet be. It does not speak plainly, for clarity is a burden that must be earned." Adric frowned, his staff tapping softly against the floor. "We've been burdened plenty already," he muttered, though his voice lacked its usual edge. The elf's gaze turned to him, their eyes narrowing slightly. "The relics you carry are not simple burdens," they said. "They are keys, crafted to unlock truths that mortals have long forgotten. But keys alone cannot open the way. Only those with the strength to endure the journey can bring them to their purpose." Orlen shifted uncomfortably, his hand brushing the ring in his pocket. The weight of it seemed heavier now, the warmth less comforting and more demanding, as though the relic itself was listening. "And what if the journey breaks us?" he asked quietly. The elf regarded him with a faint tilt of their head, their expression softening slightly. "Then the path will end," they said. "But the choice to walk it remains yours." Their words hung in the air like a challenge, and Orlen felt his resolve harden despite the knot of fear tightening in his chest. Calen, who had been silent throughout the exchange, suddenly stepped forward, his face pale but determined. "I'll go next," he said, his voice trembling but steady. Cyrana turned to him, her expression unreadable. "You don't have to," she said, though there was no insistence in her tone. Calen shook his head. "I've spent too long running from shadows," he said. "If this pool can show me what I need to face, then I'll face it." Without waiting for approval, he knelt at the edge of the pool, his hands resting lightly on his knees. Slowly, he leaned forward, his fingers brushing the water's surface. The chamber darkened almost immediately, the light of the pool shifting to a deep, eerie blue that cast sharp shadows across the room. The hum that had accompanied Cyrana's vision grew louder, more insistent, and the air seemed to vibrate with an unseen force. Orlen took an involuntary step back, his breath catching as the pool began to ripple violently. Calen's face twisted into a grimace, and his shoulders tensed, though he didn't pull away. Within the water, a new scene began to form, darker and more chaotic than the one Cyrana had witnessed. The image was a labyrinth of towering stone walls, their surfaces slick with rain and etched with jagged, broken runes. Figures moved through the maze, silent, indistinct shapes that seemed to melt into the walls as they passed. At the center of the labyrinth stood a well, its depths shrouded in impenetrable darkness. As the vision sharpened, the shadows around the well began to shift, their forms taking on twisted, grotesque shapes that seemed to watch Calen with hungry eyes. The scene pulsed with a malevolent energy, and Calen's breath quickened, his hands clenching into fists. "What does it mean?" Orlen whispered, his voice barely audible. The elf beside him didn't answer immediately, their gaze fixed on the vision. When they finally spoke, their voice was low and somber. "The labyrinth is a place of trial," they said, "a reflection of the bearer's deepest fears and regrets. Only by facing its darkness can the path forward be revealed." As the vision faded, Calen collapsed onto the floor, his breaths coming in short, ragged gasps. Orlen rushed to his side, gripping his shoulder. "Are you all right?" he asked. Calen nodded weakly, though his face was pale and his hands trembled. "I saw too much," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "But I know where we have to go." The chamber fell into an uneasy silence as Calen steadied himself, his trembling hands still clutching at the edges of the pool of clarity. The water had returned to its serene silver state, its surface once again rippling faintly as though undisturbed by the visions it had revealed. Cyrana watched him closely, her eyes sharp, while Orlen and Adric exchanged uneasy glances. The elves stood motionless, their ageless faces unreadable, though their intense gazes betrayed the weight of the moment. "What did you see?" Cyrana asked, her voice even but edged with urgency. Calen's breaths came shallow at first, and for a moment Orlen thought he wouldn't answer, but then Calen raised his head, his pale face illuminated by the faint glow of the pool. "A labyrinth," he said, his voice strained but clear. "A place of trials and shadows. There's something at its center, something waiting. I don't know what it is, but I felt it. Calling." He hesitated, his hands tightening into fists. "And I know we have to go there." The elder elf stepped forward, their shimmering robes catching the faint light of the pool. "The Labyrinth of Echoes," they said, their melodic voice resonating through the chamber. "It lies deep within the heart of the ancient forest, a place forged by the keepers to guard their most guarded truths. Many have sought its secrets, but few have returned unchanged." Their gaze swept across the group, lingering on each member before resting on Orlen. "The relics you carry are bound to this path," they continued. "The labyrinth will test you, not your strength, but your resolve, your fears, your truths. Only by facing its shadows will you uncover what lies ahead." Orlen's stomach twisted at the words, the weight of the ring in his pocket feeling heavier than ever. "What if we fail?" he asked quietly. The elf's gaze softened slightly, though their tone remained firm. "Then the labyrinth will claim you," they said, "and the truth you seek will be lost." Adric frowned, his staff tapping lightly against the stone floor as he turned toward Cyrana. "This keeps getting better," he muttered, though his tone lacked its usual sarcasm. Cyrana ignored him, her focus locked on the elves. "Can you guide us?" she asked, her voice steady. The second elf, who had remained silent, stepped forward now, their expression solemn. "The labyrinth is a path you must walk alone," they said. "Even we cannot follow where it leads, but the forest will take you to its gates. There, your choices will decide the rest." Cyrana inclined her head, accepting the words without argument, though Orlen could see the tension in her posture. "Then we'll leave at first light," she said. The group was led from the chamber to a smaller hall where they could rest. The room was simple but beautiful, its walls lined with flowering vines that filled the air with a calming fragrance. A soft light emanated from the ceiling, bathing the space in a warm glow that felt almost alive. Orlen sank onto one of the low benches carved from pale wood, the events of the day weighing heavily on him. Adric sat nearby, his staff resting across his lap as he stared at the floor in thought. Cyrana stood near the doorway, her arms crossed, while Calen sat silently in a corner, his face pale and unreadable. "Do you think we're ready for this?" Orlen asked, breaking the silence. Cyrana glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "I don't know," she admitted. "But ready or not, it's the only path we have." The night passed slowly, the group taking turns to rest while the elves kept watch. When dawn broke, it came not as sunlight piercing through the trees, but as a faint golden glow that seemed to rise from the forest itself. The air was cool and filled with the scent of dew and wildflowers as the group gathered at the sanctuary's edge. Where the elves waited to see them off, the elder elf stepped forward, their gaze lingering on each member of the group. "The forest will guide you to the labyrinth's gates," they said. "Once you enter, the sanctuary's protection will no longer reach you. Trust in each other and in yourselves." They turned to Orlen, their voice softening. "The relics chose you for a reason. Let them guide you, even in the darkest moments." Orlen nodded, though his hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his satchel. The path through the forest was unlike any they had walked before. The trees seemed to shift subtly as they moved, their branches forming arches that guided them deeper into the woods. The air grew cooler, and the light dimmed, until only faint beams of golden light filtered through the dense canopy above. Orlen felt the warmth of the ring pulsing steadily, a constant reminder of its presence, and he couldn't shake the feeling that the forest itself was watching them. Adric walked close beside him, his staff glowing faintly, while Cyrana led the way, her blade resting at her side. Calen followed silently, his gaze distant but his steps steady. After what felt like hours, the path widened, and they emerged into a clearing where a massive stone archway loomed before them. The arch was intricately carved with symbols similar to those on the sanctuary's walls, though these were darker, their edges worn as if by centuries of storms. Beyond the arch, a faint mist obscured the entrance to the labyrinth, its swirling patterns giving the illusion of movement. Cyrana stepped forward, her gaze fixed on the archway. "This is it," she said quietly. "The Labyrinth of Echoes." The group stood in silence, the weight of the moment pressing heavily on them. Orlen felt his heart pounding as he stared into the mist, the ring in his pocket pulsing in rhythm with his quickening breath. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Cyrana turned to him, her expression firm but not unkind. "Now," she said, "we step forward." Without hesitation, she passed through the archway, her figure disappearing into the mist. One by one, the others followed, their forms fading until only Orlen remained. He took a deep breath, his hand brushing the ring one last time, and stepped into the labyrinth, the mist swallowing him whole. The forest grew darker as the group pressed deeper, the towering trees forming a dense canopy that blocked out the sun's light, leaving the air thick and cool. The faint golden glow that had guided them from Eryndor was now just a memory, replaced by an eerie luminescence that seemed to emanate from the forest itself. Orlen's boots crunched softly against the carpet of fallen leaves, their dampness releasing a faint, earthy scent with every step. The silence around them was profound, broken only by the occasional rustle of unseen creatures and the steady tap of Adric's staff. Cyrana led the way, her blade drawn and gleaming faintly in the low light, its presence a silent reassurance to the group. Behind her, Orlen tightened his cloak against the sudden chill, his gaze shifting nervously between the trees, where shadows seemed to move just beyond his vision. "This forest feels alive," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Cyrana didn't turn, but her voice carried back to him, steady and calm. "It is. The Elves call this place the Veilwood, a living barrier between their sanctuaries and the outside world. It watches all who pass." The path ahead narrowed, twisting between ancient roots that jutted from the ground like gnarled fingers. The trees themselves seemed to lean inward, their twisted trunks and sprawling branches forming natural arches that loomed overhead. Adric paused to study the intricate patterns in the bark of one tree, his hand brushing against its surface. "There's magic here," he murmured. "Not just the work of the elves, something older, deeper. It's as if the forest remembers everything that's ever happened within its bounds." Calen, trailing behind, shuddered visibly, his pale face a stark contrast to the shadows around him. "I wish it didn't feel like it's remembering us," he muttered, his voice tight. As they moved further into the Veilwood, the air grew heavier, carrying with it a faint metallic tang that made Orlen's chest tighten. The path became harder to follow, overgrown with thorny brambles and moss-covered stones that seemed to shift beneath their feet. Cyrana slowed, her hand raised in a silent signal for the group to halt. "Something's ahead," she said softly, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the dense shadows. Orlen strained his ears, but heard nothing beyond the rhythmic pounding of his own heart. Adric's staff glowed faintly as he stepped closer, his expression serious. "What do you sense?" he asked. Cyrana pointed toward a cluster of trees, their thick trunks entwined with vines that shimmered faintly in the dim light. "There," she said. "The path bends, but the forest tightens around it. It could be a natural bottleneck, or something waiting." The group crept forward cautiously, their movements slow and deliberate. As they neared the bend, the faint glow of the vines grew stronger, casting an ethereal light that illuminated the path. Orlen felt the warmth of the ring in his pocket increase, its steady pulse quickening slightly, as though responding to the forest itself. "Do you feel that?" he whispered, glancing at Adric. The older man nodded, his grip on his staff tightening. "The forest knows we're here," he said simply, "and it's deciding whether to let us pass." As they rounded the bend, the path opened into a small clearing, its center dominated by a massive stone obelisk covered in glowing runes. The runes pulsed gently, their light shifting between silver and gold, casting intricate patterns onto the surrounding trees. Cyrana approached cautiously, her blade held low but ready, while the rest of the group fanned out behind her. "This is elven work," she said, her voice filled with quiet awe. "A marker, or perhaps a warning." Adric moved closer to the obelisk, his eyes scanning the runes with fascination. "These symbols are ancient, even by elven standards," he said. "They speak of protection, but also trials." Before he could elaborate, the air in the clearing shifted, growing colder. The light of the runes intensified, and a faint hum filled the space, vibrating through the ground beneath their feet. Orlen stepped back instinctively, his hand gripping the ring in his pocket as the hum grew louder. From the shadows beyond the clearing, a figure began to emerge, its form tall and cloaked in flowing robes that shimmered with an otherworldly light. The figure stopped just short of the obelisk, its face obscured by a deep hood, though its presence radiated both power and stillness. "You seek the labyrinth," the figure said, its voice melodic yet commanding, echoing faintly as though coming from a great distance. Cyrana stepped forward, her expression calm but guarded. "We do," she said. "We follow the path of the relics and seek the truth they guard." The figure tilted its head slightly, as though considering her words. "The Veilwood is a threshold," it said. "To pass through, you must prove yourselves worthy, not in strength, but in purpose." The figure raised a hand, and the light of the obelisk flared, casting the clearing into stark relief. Around them, the shadows deepened, their forms twisting and writhing as though alive. "Step forward," the figure commanded. "Let your intent be known, and the forest will decide your fate." Cyrana glanced back at the group, her gaze steady but expectant. One by one, they moved toward the obelisk, its pulsing light growing warmer as they approached. Orlen felt the ring's warmth intensify, its pulse syncing with the rhythm of the runes, and he took a deep breath as he stepped into the glow. The forest seemed to close in around him, the shadows pressing against the edges of the clearing, and he knew that whatever came next, there was no turning back. The clearing fell silent as the light of the obelisk surged, illuminating the twisted branches of the Veilwood and casting sharp shadows that seemed to writhe like living things. Orlen stood frozen, the warmth of the ring in his pocket intensifying as it pulsed in rhythm with the obelisk's glow. The cloaked figure raised its hand again, the motion deliberate and unhurried as though time bent to its will. "Your intent has been heard," it said, its melodic voice weaving through the air like a distant echo. "But words alone are not enough. The Veilwood does not let its secrets be taken lightly." Before anyone could react, the shadows at the edge of the clearing began to move, coalescing into shapes that grew sharper and more defined with every passing moment. Orlen's breath caught as the forms solidified into creatures unlike any he had seen, beasts of dark mist, their bodies shifting constantly, yet their eyes glowed with an unnatural, piercing light. Cyrana stepped forward, her blade gleaming faintly as she held it low but ready. "What are they?" she demanded, her tone steady but edged with tension. The figure tilted its head, its hooded gaze fixed on the advancing creatures. "The Veilwood's guardians," it said. "They are drawn to doubt, to fear, to the wavering heart. Prove yourselves, and they will let you pass. Falter, and they will consume you." Its words hung in the air like a command, and the group instinctively tightened their formation, with Cyrana at the forefront, Adric just behind, his staff glowing faintly, and Calen hanging back, his face pale but resolute. Orlen swallowed hard, his hand brushing against the ring in his pocket as the creatures advanced, their movements fluid and predatory. The first of the beasts lunged without warning, its form shifting mid-leap, and Cyrana met it with a swift, precise strike of her blade. The creature let out a piercing screech as it dissolved into wisps of shadow, but two more immediately took its place, their glowing eyes fixed on her with an almost sentient malice. Adric thrust his staff forward, a burst of light erupting from its tip and driving the creatures back, their forms unraveling slightly under its glow. "They're testing us," he said, his voice tight. "They're not mindless. They're watching how we respond." Orlen hesitated, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of the scene. The ring's pulse had grown stronger, its warmth spreading through him like a second heartbeat. and he felt an inexplicable pull toward the obelisk at the center of the clearing. "Hold them off," Cyrana called, her blade flashing as she struck down another creature. "Orlen, do you feel it?" she added, her gaze briefly flicking to him. He nodded, though the words stuck in his throat. The obelisk's light had grown brighter, its runes shifting and pulsing in time with the ring, and he felt a strange connection between the two, as though the relic was calling him to act. Taking a deep breath, he stepped toward the obelisk, the air around it growing warmer as he approached. The creatures seemed to sense his movement, their glowing eyes snapping toward him, but Cyrana and Adric held the line, their combined efforts keeping the beasts at bay. Orlen reached out hesitantly, his hand hovering above the surface of the obelisk. The runes flared in response, their light spreading outward in a wave that passed through the clearing like a ripple across still water. The creatures froze, their forms flickering uncertainly, and the cloaked figure lowered its hand. "The relic knows its purpose," it said, its voice softer now, almost contemplative. "But the path remains yours to choose." Orlen's hand trembled as he placed it on the obelisk, the stone's surface smooth and impossibly warm. The ring in his pocket seemed to merge with the energy of the obelisk, and for a brief moment his vision filled with light. The clearing vanished, replaced by a vivid scene that unfolded around him like a dream. He stood in the center of a vast circular chamber, its walls carved with the same glowing runes as the obelisk. In the center of the chamber stood a pedestal upon which rested a second relic, a stone tablet etched with intricate patterns that seemed to shift and shimmer as he watched. The chamber felt alive, its air humming with an energy that resonated deep within him. "The Labyrinth of Echoes," a voice said, though it came not from the cloaked figure but from the air itself. "Its gates lie ahead, but the relic must guide you. Without it, the path will close, and the truths you seek will remain hidden." The vision faded as suddenly as it had appeared, and Orlen found himself back in the clearing, the obelisk's glow dimming as the creatures around them dissolved into harmless mist. Cyrana was at his side in an instant, her expression sharp but concerned. "What happened?" she asked. Orlen opened his mouth to speak but hesitated, his mind still reeling from the vision. "I saw a chamber," he said at last. "And a relic, another relic. It's tied to the labyrinth somehow." Adric frowned, his staff dimming as the tension in the clearing eased. "Then we have our next step," he said. "The labyrinth lies ahead, but it seems we need more than just ourselves to face it." The cloaked figure inclined its head, its voice once again carrying that faint, melodic echo. "The forest has granted you passage," it said. "Beyond this clearing, the path will lead you to the labyrinth's gates. What lies within is for you to discover, but beware. The labyrinth does not suffer the unworthy lightly." With that, the figure stepped back, its form dissolving into light that swirled upward and disappeared into the canopy above. The obelisk's light faded completely, leaving the clearing bathed in the dim, shifting glow of the Veilwood. As the group gathered their bearings, Orlen felt the weight of the ring in his pocket once more, its pulse steady but insistent. The path ahead felt heavier now, the air charged with the knowledge that what awaited them would be unlike anything they had faced before. "Let's keep moving," Cyrana said, her voice firm but quiet. "The labyrinth is close. I can feel it." Together they stepped back onto the winding path, the trees closing in around them once more as the Veilwood's shadows watched their every move. The path wound deeper into the Veilwood, the trees growing closer and more twisted with each step, their branches intertwining overhead to form a canopy so dense that only faint tendrils of light filtered through. The air was thick and cool, carrying a faint metallic tang that prickled at Orlen's senses. He walked close behind Cyrana, her steady movements reassuring even as the atmosphere around them grew heavier. Adric followed just behind, his staff glowing faintly, while Calen trailed at the rear, his posture tense and his eyes darting to every shadow that shifted at the edges of the path. The Veilwood seemed alive in a way that was both enchanting and unnerving, its silence broken only by the occasional rustle of unseen creatures and the low groan of the ancient trees. "It feels like the forest is watching us," Orlen said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Cyrana glanced back at him, her expression calm but focused. "It is," she replied. "But we've been granted passage, at least for now." The group pressed on, the path narrowing as it led them toward a clearing that seemed to materialize out of the dense woods. In the center of the clearing stood an archway of black stone, its surface etched with glowing runes that pulsed faintly like a heartbeat. Beyond the archway, a shimmering veil of mist obscured whatever lay on the other side, its silver tendrils shifting and swirling as though alive. Orlen felt the warmth of the ring in his pocket intensify, its pulse aligning with the rhythm of the runes. "The labyrinth," Adric said, his voice reverent. "We've reached its gates." Cyrana stepped closer, her hand resting lightly on the hilt of her blade as she studied the archway. "This is it," she said. "The Veilwood's final trial. Whatever lies beyond this gate is what we've been preparing for." As the group approached, the runes on the archway flared brightly, casting the clearing in a pale, silvery light. The mist beyond the gate swirled faster, its movements almost impatient, and the air around them grew colder. Orlen's chest tightened as he stepped closer, the weight of the ring in his pocket now almost unbearable. "Do we all enter together?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. The answer came not from Cyrana or Adric, but from the forest itself. A deep, resonant hum filled the air, vibrating through the ground beneath their feet. The mist beyond the archway shifted, revealing faint shapes that moved within its depths, shadows of twisting corridors and towering walls. "The labyrinth accepts only those who carry purpose," a voice said, its source impossible to pinpoint. It was melodic yet commanding, echoing with a weight that seemed to press against Orlen's very soul. "Each of you must walk your own path. The truths you seek will not be shared, for they are yours alone to uncover." Cyrana's jaw tightened, but she nodded, stepping toward the gate with a resoluteness that Orlen envied. "Then we face it," she said. "Whatever it takes." One by one, the group moved toward the archway, each hesitating for a moment before stepping through the shimmering mist. Orlen watched as Cyrana vanished first, her form swallowed by the silvery haze, followed by Adric and then Calen, who cast one last glance over his shoulder before disappearing into the labyrinth. Orlen was alone now, the weight of the moment pressing heavily on him. The ring in his pocket pulsed steadily, its warmth both comforting and insistent, and he took a deep breath before stepping forward. The mist enveloped him instantly, cool and dense, and for a brief moment he felt as though he were floating in an endless void. Then the sensation shifted, and the world solidified around him. He stood in a narrow corridor of black stone, its walls smooth and cold, illuminated by a faint blue glow that seemed to emanate from the very air. The silence was absolute, broken only by the soft echo of his footsteps as he took a cautious step forward. The corridor stretched endlessly ahead, twisting and turning in ways that defied logic, and Orlen felt a deep unease settle over him. "What is this place?" he murmured, though no one was there to answer. As he moved deeper into the labyrinth, the air grew heavier, and the blue glow began to shift, flickering like distant firelight. Shadows danced along the walls, their shapes fluid and indistinct, but Orlen couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching him. The ring in his pocket grew warmer, its pulse quickening as though urging him forward. He rounded a corner and found himself in a circular chamber, its floor inlaid with intricate patterns that glowed faintly. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, upon which rested a shard of black stone, its surface etched with the same runes that marked the archway. Orlen approached cautiously, his hand hovering over the shard. The air around it seemed to hum with power, and he hesitated, his mind racing with doubts. "You doubt yourself," a voice said, and Orlen spun around, his heart pounding. The chamber was empty, but the voice persisted, soft yet piercing. "The path you walk is not one of certainty, but of choice. Do you have the strength to carry what lies ahead?" Orlen's breath caught as the shadows on the walls began to shift, forming shapes that mirrored his own, distorted and fractured but unmistakably him. They moved toward him, their forms flickering like dying flames, and he stumbled back, his hand brushing against the shard. The instant he touched it, the world around him exploded into light. Visions flashed before his eyes, scenes of the labyrinth twisting and reshaping itself, of his companions facing trials of their own, and of a massive structure at the heart of the maze, its walls carved with runes that glowed like stars. The shard in his hand pulsed with energy, and he felt its power flow through him, merging with the warmth of the ring. "The labyrinth has accepted you," the voice said, though it was softer now, almost a whisper. "But the path is far from over." When the light faded, Orlen found himself back in the corridor, the shard still clutched in his hand. The air was calmer now, the oppressive weight of the labyrinth easing slightly, and he took a shaky breath before moving forward. The corridor ahead glowed faintly, and he knew it would lead him closer to the labyrinth's heart and to whatever truths awaited them all. The air inside the labyrinth was cold, heavy, and alive with a quiet hum that seemed to resonate through the very stone of the walls. Orlen's footsteps echoed softly as he moved cautiously forward, the corridor ahead dimly lit by a faint, shifting glow that pulsed along the runes carved into the black stone. The passage twisted and turned unpredictably, its sharp angles and narrow pathways giving the disconcerting impression of being inside a living thing. The ring in Orlen's pocket pulsed with steady warmth, its rhythm syncing eerily with the glow of the runes, as though guiding him deeper into the labyrinth's heart. His breath misted in the cool air, and every sound, his footsteps, the soft rustle of his cloak, the faint whisper of his breath, seemed amplified, bouncing off the smooth walls and disappearing into the unknown. "One step at a time," he muttered to himself, his voice low and tremulous. His mind raced with thoughts of the others, Cyrana, Adric, and Calen, each now walking their own path through this maze of shadows and secrets. He wondered what trials they faced, what fears the labyrinth had conjured to test their resolve. The passage widened suddenly, opening into a circular chamber whose floor was inlaid with intricate patterns of silver and gold, glowing faintly like embers in the dark. The walls stretched upward, their surfaces etched with runes that seemed to shift and flow as Orlen approached. In the center of the chamber stood a pedestal, and upon it rested a small crystalline orb, its surface swirling with a soft inner light. The warmth of the ring in Orlen's pocket intensified as he stepped closer, its pulse quickening in a way that filled him with equal parts curiosity and dread. As he reached out to touch the orb, a voice echoed through the chamber, low and resonant, yet somehow familiar. "Do you seek answers or merely escape?" it asked, the words vibrating through the air like a distant thunderclap. Orlen froze, his hand hovering inches above the orb, his heart pounding in his chest. He began, his voice catching in his throat. "I seek the truth, about the relics, about what lies ahead." The voice responded not with words, but with a wave of light that emanated from the orb, enveloping the room in a soft glow. Images began to form in the air around Orlen, fragmented scenes that flickered and shifted like reflections on water. He saw a sprawling city of white stone, its towers gleaming in the sunlight, its streets filled with figures both familiar and strange. He saw the Pillar of Morning, standing solitary in a barren landscape, its runes glowing brighter than he remembered. And he saw the labyrinth itself, its walls twisting and reshaping, its center shrouded in impenetrable darkness. The images vanished as quickly as they had appeared, leaving Orlen alone once more, the room dim and silent except for the faint hum of the orb. "You carry the burden of choice," the voice said, softer now, yet still resonating with an undeniable weight. "The relics you bear are keys, but they will not unlock every door. What lies ahead will require more than courage. It will demand sacrifice." Orlen's hand trembled as he withdrew it from the orb, the weight of the voice's words settling heavily in his chest. He looked around the chamber, his gaze lingering on the shifting runes, the glowing patterns on the floor, and the orb that pulsed faintly like a living heart. "Sacrifice," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "What kind of sacrifice?" The voice did not answer, and the silence that followed was absolute. As Orlen turned to leave the chamber, the air grew colder, and the runes along the walls flared briefly before dimming once more. The corridor beyond the chamber stretched endlessly into the dark, its sharp turns and narrow passages disorienting in their sameness. Orlen moved carefully, the ring in his pocket guiding him with its steady pulse, though each step seemed to draw him deeper into the labyrinth's mysteries. Shadows flickered at the edges of his vision, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, not by creatures or spirits, but by the labyrinth itself, as though it were aware of his every thought and movement. He rounded another corner and found himself in a narrow passage where the walls glowed faintly with a deep blue light, their surfaces etched with jagged angular runes unlike those he had seen before. The air here felt heavier, pressing against him with an almost physical force, and the hum of the labyrinth grew louder, resonating in his chest like the toll of a distant bell. The passage led to another chamber, smaller than the first, but no less imposing. In its center stood a stone table, upon which lay a fragment of something that glowed faintly. A shard of dark crystal, its surface cracked and veined with light. As Orlen approached the table, the shard flared suddenly, its glow filling the chamber with an intense light. Images flooded his mind, the faces of his companions, each walking their own path through the labyrinth, the shadowy pursuers they had evaded since Green Hill Vale, and the Pillar of Morning, its light growing dimmer as shadows closed in around it. The images faded, and Orlen staggered back, his breath coming in sharp gasps. The shard's glow softened, and the hum of the labyrinth quieted, leaving the room steeped in an oppressive stillness. Taking a deep breath, Orlen reached for the shard, its surface cool and smooth beneath his fingers. As he lifted it from the table, the room began to shift. the walls shimmering and blurring as though the labyrinth itself was reacting to his actions. The passage behind him began to glow faintly, its runes pulsing in a steady rhythm that matched the warmth of the shard in his hand. Orlen clutched the fragment tightly, his resolve hardening as he stepped back into the corridor. He didn't know where the labyrinth would lead him next, but he knew one thing for certain: the truth he sought was somewhere ahead, and there was no turning back. The corridor stretched endlessly before Orlen, the blue light of the labyrinth's runes flickering like distant stars against the dark stone walls. Each step felt heavier than the last, the air thick with an almost tangible tension that pressed against his chest and slowed his breath. The shard in his hand pulsed faintly, its cool surface radiating a subtle energy that seemed to resonate with the labyrinth itself. The further he walked, the more the hum of the walls deepened, transforming into a low, rhythmic vibration that seemed to echo through his very bones. Orlen's thoughts raced as he clutched the shard tightly, the fragmented images it had shown him still flashing in his mind, the faces of his companions, the encroaching shadows, and the dimming light of the Pillar of Morning. The labyrinth was testing him, of that he was certain, but its purpose remained elusive, shrouded in layers of mystery that seemed to deepen with every turn. The passageway narrowed suddenly, the walls closing in around him until the air felt stifling, almost suffocating. Orlen ducked slightly to avoid a low-hanging arch of jagged stone, his movements careful and deliberate as he pressed forward. The runes along the walls shifted as he passed, their light growing dimmer, their patterns twisting into unfamiliar shapes. A faint sound echoed through the corridor, a distant whisper, too soft to discern but persistent enough to quicken his pulse. "Who's there?" he called, his voice wavering slightly. The whispering stopped abruptly, leaving only the oppressive silence of the labyrinth in its wake. Orlen tightened his grip on the shard, its steady pulse the only reassurance he had as he continued down the path. The passage opened into another chamber, this one smaller and more confined, its walls adorned with runes that pulsed with an unsettling red glow. The air here was colder, carrying a faint metallic scent that made Orlen's stomach churn. At the center of the room stood a pedestal, its surface cracked and uneven, and upon it rested a ring of dark metal, its edges sharp and jagged, its surface etched with symbols that seemed to writhe and shift like living things. The shard in Orlen's hand grew warmer as he approached, its pulse quickening in a way that mirrored the beat of his own heart. He hesitated, his gaze fixed on the ring, a sense of unease settling over him like a heavy cloak. As he reached out to touch the ring, a voice echoed through the chamber, low and distorted, its words dripping with malice. "You seek what you do not understand," it said, the sound reverberating through the room. Orlen froze, his hand hovering inches above the ring, his breath caught in his throat. "I don't seek power," he said, his voice trembling but resolute. "I seek the truth about the relics and why they chose us." The voice laughed, a harsh and grating sound that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. "Truth is a burden, little one," it said, "and burdens break even the strongest of wills." The runes along the walls flared brightly, their red glow filling the chamber with a harsh, unrelenting light. Shadows began to coalesce at the edges of the room, their forms twisting and shifting as they moved toward him. Orlen stepped back instinctively, his hand tightening around the shard as he prepared to defend himself. The shadows stopped just short of the pedestal, their glowing eyes fixed on him, their presence radiating a suffocating sense of dread. "Prove your resolve," the voice commanded, its tone sharper now, like the crack of a whip. Take the ring, or leave this place and abandon your quest." Orlen's heart pounded in his chest as he stared at the ring, its dark surface gleaming ominously in the light of the runes. The shard in his hand pulsed steadily, its warmth spreading through him like a quiet reassurance. Taking a deep breath, he stepped forward, his hand closing around the ring. The instant he touched it, the world around him shifted violently, the chamber dissolving into a storm of light and shadow. He felt a surge of energy course through him, overwhelming and disorienting, as the rune's light merged with the ring's power. The shadows around him shrieked and recoiled, their forms dissolving into the walls as the storm subsided. When the light faded, Orlen found himself back in the corridor, the ring now resting in his palm alongside the shard. Its surface was no longer jagged but smooth and cool, its symbols faint and subdued. The air around him was calmer now, the oppressive weight of the labyrinth eased, though the sense of purpose it instilled remained. Orlen slipped the ring into his pocket alongside the shard, their combined warmth a steady presence as he continued forward. The corridor ahead glowed faintly, the blue light of the runes guiding him toward what he hoped would be the labyrinth's heart. As he walked, the corridor began to widen, its walls curving outward until they formed a vast, open space illuminated by a soft, golden glow. The chamber before him was unlike any he had seen, its floor inlaid with intricate mosaics that depicted scenes of battles, triumphs, and losses, all tied to the relics and their enigmatic purpose. In the center of the room stood a massive archway, its surface carved with runes that shimmered faintly in the golden light. Beyond the arch lay a darkness so profound that it seemed to swallow the light around it, a void that pulsed faintly with an unseen energy. Orlen hesitated at the threshold, his gaze fixed on the darkness beyond the archway. The ring and shard in his pocket grew warmer, their pulse quickening as though urging him forward. Taking a deep breath, he stepped toward the arch, the golden light of the chamber dimming as the darkness reached out to meet him. "The truth lies ahead," he whispered to himself, his voice steady despite the fear that gripped him. "And I'll face it, whatever it may be." The darkness beyond the archway swallowed Orlen whole, the golden glow of the chamber behind him fading into nothingness as the oppressive void closed around him. The air was heavy, thick with an unearthly quiet that seemed to muffle even his own breath. The shard and the ring in his pocket pulsed faintly, their warmth the only anchor in a world that felt otherwise untethered from reality. Orlen took a cautious step forward, his boots making no sound against a floor he couldn't see, but somehow felt beneath him. The void was absolute, yet as his eyes adjusted, faint shapes began to emerge, twisting lines, jagged patterns, and distant lights that flickered like stars in the farthest reaches of the abyss. A low hum resonated through the void, vibrating in his chest and filling his mind with an eerie sense of anticipation. The path ahead was not clear, but the relic's steady pulse urged him onward, their rhythms syncing with the hum of the labyrinth itself. As Orlen moved deeper into the darkness, the shapes around him grew more distinct, coalescing into towering walls etched with runes that glowed faintly like embers. The runes flickered in and out, their patterns shifting as though alive, and Orlen realized with a shiver that they seemed to be responding to his presence. The hum of the labyrinth deepened, transforming into a low, resonant chant that echoed from unseen corners of the void. It was neither welcoming nor hostile, but it carried a weight that pressed heavily against Orlen's thoughts, as if testing his resolve with every step. "I'm not afraid," he whispered, though his voice faltered as the words left his lips. The runes flared briefly, their light intensifying, and the chant grew louder before subsiding once more. The path narrowed, the walls closing in on either side, and Orlen felt a claustrophobic unease creep into his chest. The air grew colder, and with each step the rune's glow dimmed until they were little more than faint traces of light against the black stone. Orlen's pulse quickened as the void pressed closer, and he found himself reaching instinctively for the shard in his pocket. Its warmth was reassuring, but the faint pulse had changed, its rhythm erratic and uneven, as though mirroring his own uncertainty. "Stay calm," he muttered to himself, his voice barely audible over the oppressive silence. He rounded a corner and froze, his breath catching in his throat. Before him stood a massive figure, its form cloaked in shadow but unmistakably humanoid. It towered over him, its presence radiating an aura of power and stillness that made the air around it feel heavy and unyielding. Its eyes, twin points of burning light, fixed on Orlen with an intensity that pierced through his very soul. "You seek the truth," the figure said, its voice a deep, resonant echo that seemed to vibrate through the walls of the labyrinth. Orlen swallowed hard, his hand tightening around the shard in his pocket. "I do," he said, his voice trembling but determined. The figure tilted its head slightly as though considering his words. "The truth is not given freely," it said. "It is earned through sacrifice and resolve. Do you possess the strength to bear it?" Orlen hesitated, his mind racing. The labyrinth had tested him at every turn, forcing him to confront his fears and doubts. But now he stood at its heart, face to face with something he could not fully comprehend. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm willing to try." The figure's burning eyes narrowed and the air around them grew colder. "Then let the labyrinth judge," it said, raising a hand wreathed in shadow. The runes on the walls flared to life, their light cascading through the void and forming a circle of glowing patterns around Orlen's feet. The hum of the labyrinth intensified, rising to a deafening crescendo that filled his mind with 1,000 overlapping voices. The ground beneath Orlen shifted, and he stumbled as the circle of light expanded, transforming into a vast glowing mosaic that depicted scenes of battles, triumphs, and losses. He saw the faces of his companions, Cyrana, her blade flashing as she faced shadowy adversaries, Adric, his staff glowing brightly as he wove spells to protect himself, Calen, his expression one of quiet determination as he navigated a maze of twisting corridors. The images shifted, showing Orlen himself standing before the pillar of mourning, the relics in his hands glowing with an intensity that rivaled the sun. The voices of the labyrinth grew louder, their words incomprehensible but charged with meaning, and Orlen felt a surge of energy course through him, both exhilarating and terrifying. The figure stepped closer, its shadowy form looming over Orlen, and the light of the mosaic dimmed. "The relics have chosen you," it said, its voice quieter now but no less commanding. "But choice alone is not enough. Will you carry their burden, knowing the cost it will demand?" Orlen's mind raced as the weight of the question pressed down on him. He thought of Greenhill Vale, of the quiet life he had left behind, of the friends he had made and the dangers they had faced together. He thought of the pillar, the labyrinth, and the truths that still lay hidden. "I will," he said at last, his voice steady. "I don't know what lies ahead, but I'll see it through." The figure regarded him for a moment before nodding slowly. "Then the labyrinth accepts you," it said, its voice reverberating with finality. The light of the runes surged, filling the void with a brilliance that forced Orlen to shield his eyes. When the light faded, the figure was gone, and Orlen stood alone in a wide corridor bathed in soft, golden light. The shard and the ring in his pocket pulsed in unison, their warmth filling him with a quiet sense of purpose. The path ahead was clear now, its walls adorned with runes that glowed steadily, their patterns guiding him toward the labyrinth's exit. As Orlen stepped forward, the hum of the labyrinth faded into silence, replaced by the faint sound of wind and the rustle of leaves. The air grew warmer, and the darkness began to lift, giving way to the soft glow of starlight filtering through the trees. He emerged into a vast forest clearing, the Veilwood's familiar canopy stretching overhead, and saw his companions waiting for him, their faces a mixture of relief and quiet determination. "You made it," Cyrana said, her voice calm but laced with an unspoken question. Orlen nodded, his gaze shifting to the horizon where the first hints of dawn painted the sky in hues of gold and crimson. "We all did," he said softly, "ma'am, and the journey isn't over yet." The forest grew quiet as the companions emerged from the labyrinth, their footsteps muffled against the mossy ground. The air was heavy with an ancient stillness, the kind that carried the weight of unspoken truths and untold histories. Orlen glanced at the others, their faces pale and worn from the trials within the labyrinth. Cyrana's eyes scanned the horizon, her hand resting lightly on the hilt of her blade, while Adric leaned against his staff, his breaths shallow but steady. Calen lingered behind, his gaze distant, as though the shadows of the labyrinth still clung to him. The forest around them seemed alive, its trees towering and twisted, their canopies intertwining to block out much of the light. Despite the quiet, Orlen could feel a faint hum in the air, a resonance that reminded him of the labyrinth's rhythm, though softer and more inviting. It was Cyrana who spoke first, her voice breaking the stillness like a blade through silence. "We need answers," she said, her tone measured but resolute. "The labyrinth revealed much, but it left us with more questions than clarity." Adric nodded, though his expression was pensive. "The relics are connected to something far older than the keepers themselves," he said, his voice low. "The visions we saw, they point to a purpose we don't yet understand. We can't continue blindly." It was then that Calen, who had been silent for much of the journey, lifted his head, his voice quiet but firm. "Starhaven," he said, the word carrying an unexpected weight. Orlen frowned, the name unfamiliar to him. "What's Starhaven?" he asked. Calen glanced at him, his pale features softening slightly. "An Elven Sanctuary," he explained. "One of the oldest. It's said to be a place of knowledge and prophecy, where even the wisest come to seek counsel." Cyrana turned sharply to Calen, her eyes narrowing. "And how do you know of such a place?" she asked, her tone edged with suspicion. Calen hesitated, his gaze flickering to the ground. "My family once spoke of it," he admitted. "When I was young, there were stories, whispers really, about a figure called the Sage of Starhaven, a guardian of wisdom, said to have lived through the ages of the Keepers. If anyone knows the truth about these relics, it's him." Cyrana studied him for a moment longer before nodding curtly. "Then that's where we go," she said. "We don't have time to question every lead. If this sage exists, he may be our only chance at understanding what we're carrying and what's chasing us." The journey to Starhaven was slow and arduous, the forest thickening around them with each passing mile. The path was little more than a faint trail winding through the underbrush, its twists and turns obscured by roots and tangled vines. Orlen felt the weight of the ring in his pocket grow heavier as they walked, its pulse steady but insistent, as though urging him onward. The others moved in silence, their weariness palpable but their determination unshaken. The trees seemed to lean closer, their branches forming arches overhead that filtered the light into soft, shifting patterns on the ground. It was Adric who finally broke the silence, his staff tapping rhythmically against the stones as he walked. If this sage is as old as the stories say, he may not take kindly to unexpected visitors, he said, his tone thoughtful. The elves are not known for their openness. Cyrana gave a faint smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. We'll deal with that when we get there, she replied. For now, we focus on finding Starhaven. Calen led the way, his movements more confident than Orlen expected, as though he could sense the path even when it was invisible to the others. Hours passed, the forest growing denser and the air cooler, until they came upon a clearing that took Orlen's breath away. In its center stood an ancient tree, its trunk massive and gnarled, its branches spreading wide and heavy with leaves that shimmered faintly in the dim light. At its base was an archway carved into the tree itself, its surface etched with glowing runes that pulsed softly, almost like a heartbeat. "This is it," Calen said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The entrance to Starhaven." Orlen stepped closer, his heart pounding as he took in the intricate carvings on the archway. The runes were unlike any he had seen before, their patterns flowing like water and shifting subtly as he watched. Cyrana approached cautiously, her hand brushing the hilt of her blade, while Adric studied the runes with quiet fascination. "This is elven magic at its finest," Adric murmured. "Older than anything we've encountered so far. It's alive." Calen stepped forward and placed a hand on the archway, his fingers tracing the runes. The air grew warmer, and the runes flared briefly before dimming again, as though recognizing his presence. A soft light began to emanate from the archway, and a voice deep and melodic echoed from within. "Travelers, you stand at the threshold of Starhaven, a sanctuary of wisdom and light. Speak your purpose, and the path shall be revealed." Cyrana stepped forward, her tone steady as she replied. "We seek the sage of Starhaven," she said. "We carry relics tied to the keepers, and we seek their truth." The voice was silent for a moment, and Orlen felt a chill run down his spine as the runes shifted again, their glow deepening to a warm gold. "Enter, if your hearts are true," the voice said at last. "But know that the wisdom you seek comes at a price." The light from the archway brightened, and the air around them seemed to shimmer. Orlen exchanged a glance with Cyrana, who nodded silently before stepping through the archway. One by one, the others followed, the light enveloping them as they passed into the sanctuary. Orlen hesitated for a moment, his hand brushing the ring in his pocket, before taking a deep breath and stepping forward. The light was warm and soft, and as it surrounded him, he felt a sense of awe wash over him, as though the forest itself was welcoming him. When the light faded, he found himself standing in a vast, open chamber filled with the soft glow of starlight, and at its center stood a figure cloaked in silver, their presence radiant and unearthly. The chamber was vast and luminous, its walls carved from living wood that shimmered faintly in the soft glow of unseen starlight. High above, the ceiling opened to the night sky where countless stars shone in intricate constellations that seemed to shift and dance. The air was cool and carried a faint, fragrant scent of blooming flowers, though no garden could be seen. In the center of the chamber stood a figure cloaked in flowing silver robes, their presence both commanding and serene. They were tall, even for an elf, and their long white hair fell in soft waves around a face that seemed untouched by time. Their eyes, bright and piercing, reflected the light of the stars, and when they spoke, their voice was like music woven into words. "You carry burdens heavier than you know," the sage said, their gaze sweeping over the companions, "and you seek truths that will demand much of you." Cyrana stepped forward, her blade sheathed but her stance firm, her voice steady despite the awe in her eyes. "We seek understanding," she said. "The relics we bear are tied to the keepers, but their purpose remains hidden. If we are to carry them, we must know what they mean." The sage inclined their head, their expression unreadable. "The relics chose you," they replied. "That alone speaks of your worth. But the truth you seek lies not in the relics themselves, but in the choices you make because of them." They turned to Orlen, their gaze resting on him for a moment longer than the others. "The ring you carry," the sage said, their voice soft but resonant, "is more than a token of the past. It is a key, one that can unlock paths long forgotten, but keys can open many doors, not all of them meant to be walked through." Orlen's hand instinctively went to the ring in his pocket, its warmth a familiar reassurance. "What does it unlock?" he asked, his voice quiet but filled with urgency. The sage smiled faintly, a gesture that carried both kindness and sadness. "That is not for me to tell," they said. "The relics speak to their bearers in their own time. But know this, the keepers created them not as weapons, but as guides. They are fragments of a greater whole, a tapestry of light and shadow that stretches across the ages." Adric stepped closer, his staff glowing faintly as he regarded the sage with a mixture of curiosity and caution. "If they are guides, then where do they lead?" he asked. The sage's gaze turned skyward, their eyes reflecting the shifting constellations above. "To a truth that lies at the edge of the world," they said. "A truth that has waited for its time to be revealed." The chamber grew quieter, the air heavy with the weight of the sage's words. Calen, who had been standing silently at the back of the group, spoke at last, his voice low and hesitant. "And what of the shadows that follow us?" he asked. "Do they seek the same truth?" The sage's expression darkened, their piercing eyes narrowing slightly. "The shadows seek only to unmake," they said. "They are echoes of a broken past, bound by hatred and fear. They cannot wield the relics, but they can destroy what they cannot possess. That is their purpose, and it will not change." The companions exchanged uneasy glances, the gravity of the sage's words settling heavily upon them. Cyrana straightened, her voice firm as she asked, "Then how do we stop them? If the relics are to guide us, how do we ensure they don't fall into the wrong hands?" The sage turned their full attention to her, their gaze unwavering. "The relics chose you because they saw in you the strength to carry them," they said. "But strength alone is not enough. You must understand the relics, not as tools, but as a reflection of yourselves. Only then can you wield their true power." They gestured to the chamber's far wall, where a large, ornate mirror hung, its surface shimmering with an otherworldly light. "Step forward," the sage said. "Look into the mirror of stars. It will show you what you must see." The companions hesitated, their gazes shifting uneasily toward the mirror. Cyrana was the first to move, her steps measured as she approached the glowing surface. The light of the mirror flared as she stood before it, and her reflection rippled and shifted, revealing a scene of battle. A younger Cyrana, her blade raised against a shadowy foe, her expression fierce but pained. The image faded, replaced by another. Cyrana standing alone in a vast, empty field, the weight of her blade dragging her to her knees. She turned away abruptly, her face set in a mask of determination, but Orlen could see the tension in her shoulders. Adric stepped forward next, his staff glowing brighter as he faced the mirror. His reflection shimmered, revealing a vast library filled with endless rows of ancient tomes, each one glowing faintly with magic. Adric reached for one of the books, but as his hand touched its cover, the light dimmed, and the shelves began to collapse around him. He stepped back from the mirror, his expression unreadable, though his grip on his staff tightened. Calen approached last, his movements slow and reluctant. The mirror's light dimmed as he stood before it, revealing a single image. Calen alone in a dark, twisting corridor, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear. He turned to Orlen as though seeking help, but no one came. Calen stepped back quickly, his breath shallow as he avoided meeting anyone's gaze. Orlen hesitated, his heart pounding as he stepped toward the mirror. The light flared once more, and his reflection rippled, revealing a field of stars stretching endlessly into the void. In the center of the field stood a single figure, shrouded in shadow, its form indistinct but unmistakably familiar. The figure turned toward him, its glowing eyes locking with his own, and Orlen felt a chill run through him as the reflection dissolved into darkness. The mirror's light faded, and the chamber was silent once more. The sage regarded them all with a calm yet penetrating gaze. "The mirror reveals not the future, but the truth of your hearts," they said. "You must carry these truths with you as you walk your path. Only then can you wield the relics as they were meant to be." They stepped forward, their silver robes shimmering in the soft starlight. "Your journey is far from over," they said, "but you leave Starhaven with the knowledge you need to face what lies ahead. Trust in yourselves and in each other." The chamber's light dimmed slightly as the companions stood in silence, the sage's words lingering like echoes in the cool air. Orlen's heart was heavy, the vision from the mirror of stars etched into his mind. The shadowed figure he had seen felt closer now, its presence unsettling and inescapable, but he knew they couldn't remain in Starhaven forever. Cyrana stepped forward, her voice steady but quiet. "You've shown us much," she said, addressing the sage, "but we still don't know where the relics are leading us. If they're meant to guide, we need to understand their path." The sage's gaze shifted upward, their piercing eyes reflecting the starlight above. "The relics will lead you to the final sanctuary of the Keepers," they said, "but the path is veiled in shadow, and only those who can endure the trials of the sanctuaries will uncover its truth." They gestured toward a carved doorway at the far end of the chamber, its edges lined with glowing runes. "Beyond this threshold lies the path you must take. It will lead you through the remnants of the sanctuaries, where the Keeper's wisdom and their warnings still linger. Follow it with care, for not all who walk it reach its end." The companions exchanged uncertain glances, the weight of the sage's words pressing heavily upon them. Adric tapped his staff softly against the ground, the faint glow at its tip pulsing rhythmically. "If this path takes us to the truth," he said, "then we'll walk it. But the Keeper's sanctuaries are ancient. How can we trust that their wisdom hasn't been corrupted over time?" The sage turned to him, their expression unreadable but calm. "Wisdom does not corrupt, but those who seek to twist it do," they replied. "The shadows that follow you will attempt to poison what you learn. It is your task to discern truth from lies and hold to your purpose." Their gaze moved to Calen, whose pale face betrayed his unease. And you, they said gently, must decide whether you are ready to face your fears or let them guide your steps. Fear is a powerful master, but it is an even greater teacher when confronted. Calen's eyes widened, but he said nothing. His hands clenched tightly at his sides. The sage stepped closer to Orlen, their presence radiating warmth and stillness. You carry the burden of leadership, though you do not yet realize it, they said softly. The ring you hold is not merely a key, but a symbol of unity, one that binds your group together. Its warmth is not just its power, but yours, a reflection of your ability to draw strength from those around you and to offer it in return. Orlen swallowed hard, the ring in his pocket suddenly feeling heavier than ever. I'm just trying to understand all of this, he said quietly. I didn't ask for this role. The sage's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. Few do, they replied, but the relic chose you for a reason, and in time, you will understand. Cyrana moved to stand beside Orlen, her blade still sheathed but her presence commanding as always. Then we follow the path, she said firmly. We've come too far to turn back now. The sage nodded, their silver robes catching the faint glow of the runes as they moved toward the carved doorway. They traced a hand along its edges, and the runes flared brightly, the air shimmering as the door began to open. Beyond it lay a winding path through the forest, its edges lined with glowing stones that pulsed faintly in rhythm with the relics. This path will take you to the next sanctuary, the sage said. Follow it with resolve and trust in each other. The shadows will test your bonds, but they cannot break what is truly strong. The companions stepped forward, the light from the open doorway casting long shadows behind them as they prepared to leave. The sage watched them in silence, their presence both comforting and distant, like a star that guided from afar but could not walk the path alongside them. Orlen paused at the threshold, glancing back at the sage. Will we meet again? He asked. The sage tilted their head slightly, their expression serene. Perhaps, they said. But Starhaven is not where your journey ends. Seek the sanctuaries, and you may find more than you expect. As the group stepped onto the forest path, the doorway behind them closed, the runes fading into the wood as though they had never been there. The air outside was cool and fresh, the faint rustle of leaves and the distant call of nightbirds filling the silence left by the sage's parting words. The glowing stones along the path cast a soft, steady light, guiding their way through the dense forest. Cyrana led the way, her movements deliberate and purposeful, while Adric followed close behind, his staff raised like a beacon. Orlen walked beside Calen, who remained quiet but no longer avoided his gaze. The weight of the ring in Orlen's pocket felt different now, not heavier but more defined, as though its purpose had shifted with their steps. The path twisted and turned, leading them deeper into the forest, and Orlen couldn't help but glance back once more, though the entrance to Starhaven was already lost to the trees. The sage's words echoed in his mind, their weight both reassuring and daunting. The sanctuaries will test us, he said aloud, more to himself than to the others. Cyrana glanced back at him briefly, her eyes sharp but not unkind. Then we'll face those tests, she said simply. Together. Orlen nodded, his steps growing steadier as they followed the glowing stones into the night, the faint hum of the forest guiding them toward whatever lay ahead. The forest seemed to breathe with an ancient rhythm, its towering trees swaying gently as if bowing to an unseen force. Orlen felt the warmth of the ring pulse steadily in his pocket, its rhythm matching the faint hum that resonated through the ground beneath his boots. The path had grown narrower, flanked by moss-covered stones and twisted roots that jutted out like fingers reaching for the sky. Cyrana walked ahead, her blade sheathed but her hand never straying far from its hilt. Adric followed close behind, his staff glowing faintly in the dim light that filtered through the dense canopy. Calen lingered at the rear, his steps cautious, his gaze darting to the shifting shadows at the edge of the path. The air carried the faint scent of blooming flowers and damp earth, a reminder of the magic that lingered in these woods. "This is the last sanctuary," Cyrana said, her voice quiet but resolute. "The sage said it would hold the answers we need." The group moved in silence, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of leaves and moss. The path began to widen, and ahead, the forest opened into a glade bathed in soft, golden light. At its center stood a structure unlike any they had seen. A vast dome of living wood and crystal, its walls shimmering with the light of 1,000 stars. The sanctuary seemed to grow organically from the earth, its roots entwined with the soil, its branches stretching skyward as though drawing power from the heavens. Orlen felt a wave of awe wash over him as they approached, the warmth of the ring intensifying with each step. "It's beautiful," he murmured, his voice barely audible. Adric nodded, his gaze fixed on the sanctuary. "This place is alive," he said, "every part of it. The magic here is ancient, older even than the sage." As they reached the sanctuary's entrance, the air grew warmer, and the faint hum that had followed them through the forest swelled into a harmonious melody. The doors, carved from a single piece of luminous crystal, swung open with a soft, resonant sound, revealing a chamber bathed in light. The walls were lined with intricate carvings that seemed to shift and flow like water, depicting scenes of battles, celebrations, and gatherings of elves and figures shrouded in mystery. At the center of the chamber stood a pedestal, upon which rested a single artifact, a staff of dark wood crowned with a glowing crystal that pulsed faintly, its light casting long shadows across the room. Cyrana stepped forward cautiously, her eyes scanning the room for any sign of danger. "What is it?" Orlen asked, his gaze fixed on the artifact. Adric moved closer, his expression one of awe and apprehension. "A keeper's staff," he said, his voice reverent. "It's said that the last of the keepers left their staffs in the sanctuaries, binding their power to these places to preserve their wisdom and their warnings." Calen hesitated at the threshold, his eyes darting to the carvings on the walls. "Then this is it," he said quietly. "The final sanctuary, the last light of the Elves." The air grew heavier as the group stepped into the chamber, the melody around them shifting into a deeper, resonant tone. Orlen felt the warmth of the ring spread through his chest, a strange sensation that filled him with equal parts hope and dread. As he approached the pedestal, the crystal atop the staff flared brightly, its light filling the chamber and illuminating the carvings in vivid detail. Scenes of the keepers rise and fall played out before them, elves crafting the relics in secret, their light shining against a backdrop of shadowy figures that seemed to stretch endlessly across the horizon. The scenes shifted, showing the keepers scattering the relics to distant corners of Middle-earth, their faces solemn as the shadows closed in around them. The light dimmed and the melody faded into silence as the crystal's glow softened once more. Cyrana reached for the staff, her hand hovering above it as though afraid to disturb its stillness. "What does it mean?" Orlen asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Adric turned to him, his expression grave. "The keepers knew they couldn't hold the shadows at bay forever," he said. They left their relics as a beacon for those who would come after them, a way to unite their strength and face what they could not. The room grew colder, and the light of the star flickered briefly. Orlen felt a chill run down his spine as the carvings on the walls began to shift again, this time forming a single, towering figure cloaked in shadow. Its presence was overwhelming, and the air seemed to tremble with its weight. "The shadows," Calen whispered, his voice trembling. "They're still coming." Cyrana's hand closed around the staff, and the light flared brightly once more, driving the shadows back and filling the chamber with warmth. The melody returned, stronger and more harmonious than before, and Orlen felt a flicker of hope ignite within him. "Then we take the staff," Cyrana said firmly, "and we prepare for what's ahead." The chamber pulsed with life as the staff's light filled the space, its glow shifting from a soft gold to a deeper, more resonant blue. Cyrana gripped the artifact firmly, her posture rigid as though the weight of the staff extended far beyond its physical form. The runes along its length shimmered faintly, their patterns flowing like liquid starlight, and the carvings on the walls seemed to respond, their scenes flickering and shifting with new intensity. Orlen watched in awe as the room transformed before his eyes, the light revealing hidden details within the carvings. Figures stepping out of shadow, their forms blurred but unmistakably elven, holding the relics high as they faced a churning sea of darkness. "The Keepers," Adric murmured, his staff glowing faintly as though resonating with the artifact. "This place isn't just a sanctuary. It's a record, a message they left behind." The air grew colder, the melody in the chamber deepening into a low hum that seemed to vibrate through the very stone beneath their feet. Orlen felt the pulse of the ring in his pocket grow erratic, its warmth intensifying as the staff's light flared brighter. He stepped closer to Cyrana, his voice unsteady. "What's happening?" he asked, his gaze darting between the glowing staff and the shifting carvings. Cyrana didn't respond immediately, her attention fixed on the artifact as though listening to something only she could hear. When she spoke, her voice was low but steady. "It's showing us what we need to see," she said. "The answers we came for." As the group stood in silence, the walls of the chamber seemed to dissolve, replaced by a vast, swirling void filled with stars and shadows. They were no longer standing in the sanctuary, but in a space that felt infinite and otherworldly. The light of the staff extended outward, forming a glowing pathway that stretched into the distance, its edges blurred and indistinct. Figures began to emerge from the shadows, their forms tall and regal, their faces ageless and solemn. They carried relics of all shapes and sizes, rings, staffs, amulets, each one glowing with a unique light that pushed back the encroaching darkness. One of the figures stepped forward, their presence commanding yet serene. They spoke, their voice echoing in a language that Orlen couldn't understand but somehow felt he knew. Adric's eyes widened, his staff trembling in his grip. "They're speaking of the sanctuaries," he said, his voice filled with awe. "Each one holds a fragment of the truth, scattered across Middle-earth to protect it from the shadows. Together they form the whole, the key to restoring balance." The figure raised their relic high, its light intensifying, and the void shifted again, revealing a towering structure at the center of the vision. It was a spire of blinding light and impenetrable shadow, its form shifting and writhing as though alive. "The source," Cyrana said, her voice sharp with realization. "That's where the relics are leading us. That's what the Keepers were trying to protect." The figure's gaze turned toward the group, their eyes locking with Orlen's. The warmth of the ring in his pocket surged, and he felt a wave of emotion wash over him. Fear, hope, determination, all blending into a single, overwhelming certainty. But they couldn't reach it, Adric said quietly, his expression heavy. The shadows overtook them before they could complete their task. The vision began to fade, the void collapsing in on itself as the group was returned to the sanctuary. The walls reappeared around them, the carvings glowing faintly as the staff's light dimmed to a soft, steady glow. Cyrana lowered the staff, her hand trembling slightly as she turned to face the others. "We know where we're going," she said firmly. "But the path won't be easy." Adric nodded, his expression thoughtful. "The Enchanted Forests," he said. "That's where the next sanctuary lies. It's the last step before we face the spire." Calen shifted uneasily, his gaze lingering on the carvings. "And the shadows?" he asked, his voice quiet. "They'll follow us, won't they?" Cyrana's grip on the staff tightened, her expression hardening. "Let them," she said. "We've made it this far. We'll make it further." Orlen felt the weight of her words settle over him, the warmth of the ring a constant reminder of the responsibility they all carried. He stepped forward, his voice steady. "Then we move forward," he said. "Together." The group exchanged determined glances, their resolve unspoken but clear as they turned toward the sanctuary's exit. As they stepped back into the golden light of the glade, the air felt lighter as though the forest itself recognized their purpose. The path ahead was clear, the faint glow of the stones marking their way deeper into the elven lands. Orlen glanced back at the sanctuary one last time, its dome shimmering in the sunlight like a distant star. "The last light of the elves," he whispered, the words both a farewell and a promise. With the relics guiding their steps and the shadows looming behind them, the group set off toward the Enchanted Forests, their journey far from over, but their resolve stronger than ever. The golden light of the sanctuary's glade faded into the dense emerald canopy as the group moved further along the path, their steps steady but weighted with the revelations they carried. The forest around them grew quieter as though holding its breath, the hum of ancient magic receding into the soft rustle of leaves and the faint song of unseen birds. Orlen walked at the center of the group, the ring in his pocket pulsing gently, its warmth a constant presence as he mulled over the vision they had witnessed. The spire of light and shadow loomed in his mind, a beacon and a warning all at once. Cyrana held the keeper's staff firmly, its glow muted now but no less significant, the runes along its length shimmering faintly in rhythm with their steps. Adric trailed slightly behind, his staff glowing softly as he muttered to himself, his thoughts clearly occupied with the fragments of knowledge the sanctuary had revealed. Calen, quieter than usual, kept to the rear, his gaze darting to the shadows at the edge of the path, as though expecting the darkness to leap out and claim them at any moment. The path began to climb, the forest thinning slightly as the terrain grew rockier. The faint glow of the guiding stones flickered briefly, and the companions paused, their breaths misting in the cooler air. "The way forward feels uncertain," Adric said, his voice tinged with unease. "The stones are faltering. The magic here must be fading." Cyrana nodded, her expression unreadable as she scanned the path ahead. "The sanctuaries weren't meant to last forever," she said. "The keepers built them as a safeguard, but even their magic has limits." Her hand tightened on the staff, the glow of its crystal flaring briefly before dimming again. "We're on our own from here." As the group pressed on, the atmosphere grew heavier, the light filtering through the trees dimming as clouds gathered above. The path narrowed again, its edges lined with jagged stones that jutted out like teeth. Orlen felt the warmth of the ring shift, its pulse quickening as though sensing something ahead. "Do you feel that?" he asked, his voice low. Cyrana stopped abruptly, her gaze narrowing as she held the staff higher, its light cutting through the growing shadows. "We're not alone," she said, her tone sharp. The forest around them seemed to hold its breath, the rustling of leaves replaced by an eerie silence. From the shadows ahead, a figure emerged, its form cloaked in tattered robes that billowed despite the still air. Its face was obscured, but its presence radiated a chilling malice that sent a shiver down Orlen's spine. The ring in his pocket grew hot, its pulse erratic, and he instinctively reached for it, his fingers closing around its smooth surface. "A shadow," Calen whispered, his voice trembling. The figure stepped closer, its movements deliberate and unhurried, as though it had all the time in the world. "You carry the light of the keepers," it said, its voice a rasping whisper that echoed unnaturally through the forest. "But light cannot escape shadow." Cyrana stepped forward, the staff's light flaring as she held it in front of her. "We've faced shadows before," she said firmly, "and we'll face you too." The figure paused, its head tilting slightly as though amused. "Bravery will not save you," it said. "The relics you bear are a beacon, but they are also a curse. They will draw us to you, no matter how far you run." The shadows around the figure writhed, twisting into tendrils that reached toward the group like living things. Orlen felt his chest tighten as the darkness pressed closer, but the ring in his hand grew warmer, its pulse steadying as though to counter the shadow's malice. Adric raised his staff, its light growing brighter as he stepped beside Cyrana. "We're not running," he said, his voice calm but resolute. The light from his staff joined the glow of the keeper's staff, the combined brilliance forcing the shadowed figure to recoil slightly. Orlen stepped forward then, the ring in his hand burning like a small sun. The warmth spread through him, filling him with a quiet strength he hadn't known he possessed. "The relics chose us for a reason," he said, his voice steady. "And we're not giving up on their purpose." The figure hissed, its form flickering like a dying flame. "Then you will fall," it snarled, its voice rising in pitch as the shadows surged forward. Cyrana thrust the staff into the ground, its light exploding outward in a wave that pushed the darkness back. The shadowed figure let out a guttural cream, its form unraveling as the light overwhelmed it. The forest grew brighter, the air clearing as the shadows dissolved into nothingness. Orlen exhaled slowly, his grip on the ring loosening as its warmth faded to a steady pulse. "Is it gone?" Calen asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Cyrana nodded, though her expression remained wary. "For now," she said. "But it's right. They'll keep coming." The group stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their journey pressing heavily upon them. Adric broke the stillness, his voice thoughtful. "The sanctuaries are behind us now," he said. "The Enchanted Forests lie ahead. Whatever truths the relics hold, we'll have to uncover them on our own." Orlen glanced at Cyrana, her grip on the staff firm, but her gaze distant. "Then we keep moving," she said, her voice resolute. "The sanctuaries gave us the light. It's up to us to carry it forward." As the group continued down the path, the forest began to change, its trees growing taller and wilder, their roots twisting into intricate patterns that wove together like threads of an ancient tapestry. The air grew warmer, and the faint sound of distant waterfalls carried through the trees, mingling with the soft hum of unseen life. Orlen felt the ring's pulse align with the rhythm of the forest, its warmth a quiet reminder of the light they carried. The Enchanted Forests awaited, their beauty and danger intertwined, and the companions moved forward with the knowledge that their journey was far from over, but their purpose clearer than ever.